will go ahead and begin. Welcome, everybody. I'm very heartened by the responsiveness from all of the amazing teacher scholars present on our panel, and overwhelmed by the responsiveness to our invitation to join us today. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm Christina Faust. I'm an associate professor and chair of the Department of Communication Studies. And I wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement. The University of Denver resides on lands that are held in stewardship by the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. We acknowledge the descendant communities of the Northern Cheyenne Tribe of Montana, the Northern Arapaho Tribe of Wyoming, and the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma, as well as other indigenous tribes and nations who call Colorado home, for their sacrifices and the hardships they have faced and they continue to face and make and have made. We are grateful to be here to learn and reflect together today on radical forgiveness, imagination, and justice in our teaching. We are very grateful for the support of the Office of Teaching and Learning and the Department of Communication Studies for providing the funds for our Qdoba lunch. I wanted to also give special thanks to the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences Visiting Marsico Visiting Scholar and Artist Committees and Funds, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, iRise, Campus Life and Inclusive Excellence, as well as the Chancellor's Office for all providing funding for us to bring Dr. Johnson radical forgiveness and radical imagination to the University of Denver. So thanks to everyone there. Special thanks. I wanted to give a special thanks to our office manager, Paula Martin, for all of her help in coordinating and setting up, Thomas Walker, as well as Sarah Baugh, who is a doctoral candidate in communication studies and contributed much intellectual, organizational, and other forms of labor to the panel today. So thank you all. A quick note to please drop by Chambers Center 120 today and tomorrow to participate in Radical Forgiveness. We are also hosting Radical Imagination for drop-in hours tomorrow, 8:30 to 10 a.m. in the AAC 340, 1:30 to 3 p.m. in AAC 301, and 3:15 to 4:45 in AAC 301. So please come participate in these remarkable events. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Amber Johnson as an award-winning scholar and teacher whose work merges qualitative, critical, arts-based methods, theories, and contexts. Their numerous projects advance understandings of identity, protest, social justice, performance, and aesthetics through deep and creative engagements on and off campus. I'm personally inspired by Dr. Johnson's materialization of academic work as a synergy between some of the traditional categories of teaching, research, and service, all the while advancing justice through process as well as product. I'm excited to convene a panel of scholars from across DU to engage Dr. Johnson and the Justice Fleet's remarkable work, beginning with the idea of radical forgiveness. As written on the Justice Fleet website, radical forgiveness assumes that in a socially unjust world, we experience moments that require small and large acts of repair. Radical forgiveness is a fluid and deliberate process that allows us to repair the tears, rips, and gaping wounds that impede us from being better versions of ourselves and bettering our world. Radical forgiveness is an invitation to deep reflection and reflexivity, to recall, feel, heal, and let go, among many other different practices that are unique to persons who participate in it. As the Justice Fleet website also states, our country rests at a pivotal moment of political divisiveness around social identities. We are constantly confronted with negative imagery, stereotypes, oppressive language, and violence. These images and experiences embed themselves into our thoughts and minds, creating a culture of fear around our own biases and prejudices. Radical imagination challenges us to move past appropriations of imagination, as in the kind of hip Silicon Valley ideology of Imagineering, to a collective process that acknowledges power, privilege, and oppression from the start, so that it doesn't replicate it in the process or the product. At the same time, radical imagination embraces aesthetics, play, performance, dialogue, process as figurative of now and in the future a different way of being. So, today's panel will offer a set of questions to each of our panelists. As I typically do, I kind of let my mind get ahead of me where I want to go and not really think about time, so I'm going to try to be diligent about keeping time as the moderator today. I do want to provide very brief introductions of the rest of our panelists in the order that they will be speaking. Each will have approximately 8 to 10 minutes to answer the question. If we have some time for cross-conversation, we'll have that, but we will also have space to hear from our guest respondent and visitor, Dr. Johnson, and then a little time to open it up for Q&A from the audience. So our first panelist is Robin Walker-Sterling, an associate professor of law here at DU. Dr. Walker-Sterling's research and teaching interests include clinical advocacy, criminal law, and juvenile justice. We also welcome Nancy Wadsworth, associate professor of political science. Dr. Wadsworth's teaching and research engage political thought, social movement, indigenous people's politics, and political forgiveness. Welcome also to Taisha McMickens, a PhD candidate in communication studies, who has participated extensively in developing and teaching the COM 2000 Identities in Dialogue curricular pilot, while she's researching intersectional identities and, oh, by the way, finishing up her comprehensive exams, among many other wonderful things. Welcome to Ramona Beltran, Associate Professor from the Graduate School of Social Work, who explores the intersections of historical trauma, embodiment, and environmental and social determinants of health, as well as how innovative qualitative methods may decolonize knowledge. We welcome Erica Trigoso, Teaching Associate Professor of Geography and the Environment, who focuses on vulnerability and adaptation to climate change, among other topics in teaching and research. Welcome also to Scott Luteniger, Professor and Chair of Computer Science, who focuses in teaching and research on humane gaming, broadening participation in computing, and the intersections of computing and art. And lastly, a very special welcome to Valentina Irtube-Legrave, the Associate Director of Inclusive Teaching Practices at OTL, who works in collaboration with faculty to design and implement transformative learning environments at DU. I'm going to take a breath and applaud these great folks. All right, so let's go ahead and begin with Professor Walker-Sterling. As the Justice Fleet suggests, radical forgiveness invites deep reflection and reflexivity in the face of shame and guilt, perhaps even trauma and violence. It defies simplistic ideological messages like, say you're sorry, or forgive and forget. What lessons or illustrations does your work around the juvenile justice system provide for how radical forgiveness might work or might not work?
Thank you. I think I can pinpoint 3 factors that lead to the main impediments in radical forgiveness, both in the juvenile justice system and that also inform how I teach my students. I teach the criminal defense clinic and the immigration law and policy clinics at the law school. And so the students in my course have cases and actually represent clients, and I and my co-teacher supervise them as they litigate cases and learn what it means to be a lawyer, what it means to have a client, what it means to have power, how to use that power, how to intentionally take steps to even the power distribution when you're standing in court next to somebody who's been accused of doing something that is against the law.
We can't hear.
Oh, uh-oh. Oh, yeah, stretch to them.
Mics are for the camera.
Would apologies.
They're not, those mics are just for the camera. They're not for the audience.
Okay, I'll talk louder. All right. So the first factor I'll mention is the enormous caseloads that defense attorneys and prosecutors have. We process an enormous number of people through our criminal justice system and through our juvenile justice system. And in fact, with my students, I often call it the criminal processing system and the juvenile processing system, because with the volumes of people that we process, there's no justice in it. And we use these systems as revenue generating enterprises, right, to get fines and to pay for all sorts of things, some of which have to do with rehabilitation and redemption and sort of recognizing that someone's made a mistake and their capacity to learn from that mistake, and lots of things that don't. So I'm sure many of the folks here know that the U.S., we incarcerate the highest number of people in the world. And that's been our distinction for years now. And that number is actually the number of people that we incarcerate. It wasn't always this high. So in around 1972, around there, we had something like 350,000 people in prisons and jails in our country. Now we have something like 6 times that. So it's something like 2.3 million people in prisons and jail. When you add in everyone who's under some form of court supervision in terms of probation and parole, that number balloons to something like 9 million people, right? And that number and this revenue generating enterprise of incarcerating people, of getting fines from them, it is a $1 billion enterprise, right? If anyone in here has any kind of a retirement account, unless you are very diligent, your retirement account probably invests in some private prisons, right? It makes a lot of money. So the economics, the lure of the economics of that help prop up this really seductive mythology that unless we consciously resist it, we're easily taken in by. And so one of those things is that it's okay for us to be processing the number of people that we're processing through the juvenile and criminal justice systems. Before I became a law professor, I was a criminal defense attorney, and I specialized in representing juvenile cases. I had kids who ended up going to detention centers for graffiti, for disorderly conduct, for mooning someone, right? This is the kind of this kind of mythology is a thing that is an impediment to radical forgiveness, because when we are accustomed to criminalizing everything, it relieves us of the obligation of forgiving anything. So that's my first suggestion. My second one is that we have moved. It's a corollary to the first. We've moved from a robust reliance on informal institutions of social control, like not even just schools, but neighborhood communities and extended families. We're moving away from those concepts and more looking to the criminal and juvenile justice systems as a one-size-fits-all to answer all problems. The result of that is that we forget often that kids are kids. And so, for example, that mooning case, kids, that's what kids do, right? Like, yeah, there you go. She did it, right? Right? That's what kids do. Kids, they cross boundaries and they press buttons and they test limits. That's what they do. And in fact, it's integral to who they are, right? That's a great, so like whenever I have a friend of mine who tells me something that their teenage son or daughter has done that's, outrageous or whatever else, I say to them, and they ask me this for a reason, because I will always say to them, excellent, you are doing a great job as a parent, because that's exactly what they should be doing. Exactly, right? But we criminalize that behavior because we have this arcane allegiance to this idea of children being seen and not heard. We like to create spaces where children are not welcome. We like to create spaces where children are not welcome to be children, right? Right. So like you know how many folks have been on an airplane and somebody walks by with a baby, and you see a bunch of people around where they're sitting grimace or frown or be upset, right? It's a baby, right? Right? But we have this idea that kids, we subscribe to an authoritarian theory of children's rights as opposed to an empowerment theory of children's rights, right? Children's rights mostly derive from their parents' ability to control and discipline them, instead of being, innate to the children and to their right to express themselves and be who they are and explore who they are and learn what they want, right? And that tension, when there's a tension like that, the parents' rights always win out. So that's the second thing, is the less reliance on informal institutions of social control, and the third one is obviously racism, and I don't know how to say it more complicated than that, but it's disproportionate minority contact in the juvenile justice system is well known. I hope it's not controversial for me to say that the juvenile justice system, as it operates in a disproportionate manner, is disproportionately harsh for juveniles of color. And that's true at every discretion point in the system. At every point where somebody has a choice about what to happen, what will happen to the child of color is worse than what would happen to a similarly situated white child. The factors that contribute to that, the stereotypes, the implicit bias, the lack of implicit bias training, all of that contributes to that, also leads to an impediment in achieving radical forgiveness, because it's hard for people to get past what they expect to see. So I'll close by saying the thing that I hope is one of the solutions, or one of the things that can push us closer towards radical forgiveness, and it's the thing that I encourage most in my students, is really real and meaningful reliance on the client's narrative, on telling the client's story. It's literally the most disruptive thing you can do in court, is to take 5 minutes for a bond hearing instead of 30 seconds. I mean, honestly. So being true to the client's narrative and calling out racism when you see it. I always tell a story of my first trial. The officer testified about the why he approached the car. And then in our closing arguments, the prosecutor said something like, "We know what this was, Your Honor. This was a drug deal." When the officer hadn't said anything like that. The officer had said that one black man had walked up to two other black men sitting in a car and greeted them. So I got up in my closing argument and I said, "And I can't believe in 2001 that we can countenance racist arguments like the one the prosecutor just made. And it was like somebody like somebody like ripped a needle off a record. And I remember standing in that moment thinking, my saying that was racist got more of a reaction than him making the racist argument in the first place. So those are the factors that I would identify and the possible solution that I would contribute.
So much. So, next we will hear, turn to Professor Wadsworth. Your ASEM Political Forgiveness was a special interterm course in Rwanda this December. And on the syllabus, it asks a pretty provocative question. How can one group or one individual find peaceful ways to come to terms with another who, through socioeconomic arrangements, ideology, and systematic violence, has damaged or destroyed members of his or her community, their community? Did your course reveal any new insights, and how might our teaching and learning here at DU, an institution whose inheritance includes systematic violence against indigenous communities like the Cheyenne and Arapaho, according to the Evans report, what new insights might we learn from this?
Thank you. So I was panicked about, I have something I want to do that is challenging to do in the time, and so being panicked that I only had 5 minutes to do that, I'm much less panicked now. But I'm going to set aside the University of Denver John Evans committee that looked at the role of DU's founder, John Evans, in the Sand Creek Massacre. Though those questions I can take up in Q&A, and there are issues here that bear on that. Just a matter of the overall arch of like how I got to this interterm course. My work has traditionally been, the first 10 years of my work were on reconciliation efforts among evangelical Christians across race. Shameless plug for my book, Ambivalent Miracles, Evangelicals and the Politics of Racial Healing. So I worked on that for a long time, and in the process of that, developed an advanced seminar for our undergraduates, so senior level seminar on forgiveness in personal and political contexts. And I have students from that seminar, which is being taught this quarter, in the room. This Rwanda class was a special version of that seminar that focused just on Rwanda, which in the normal class, the regular class is just one unit among 5 big units. So we went to Rwanda for 2 weeks in December, 5 seniors and 1 sophomore. And the course was built around an effort to understand the long history that created the context and conditions for the 1994 genocide, including Belgian colonialism, the revolution, the rise of Hutu power, and so forth. We were learning about state and civil society approaches to collective repair, to skills building, to care for the traumatized, and to collective healing. We visited 6 national memorials. This is the one in Kigali, and met with 4 different organizations that were either civil society organizations or state organizations that were focused on repair. We met many Rwandans in the process who shared their lives and stories and hopes for their country with us. And the students then pursued complex questions they had as they moved deeper and deeper and deeper into the complexity of this issue in their own research projects, which they've done blog posts about, and I hope to share publicly. One thing I want to mark clearly is that in Rwanda, as with the Cheyenne and Arapaho communities, which Ramona and I learned very, very early in the process of the DU John Evans Committee, the operative word is not forgiveness. The operative word is healing. Forgiveness isn't something that can be imposed or pressured, but repair, reconciliation, unification are definitely words that are operative in Rwanda's process in the wake of genocide. Itorero is the country's term for building a set of shared values where they're no longer, the operative constructed categories of race and ethnicity no longer exist. And that has a shadow side, which is that it's virtually prohibited for people to talk of Hutu and Tutsi now in Rwanda today. But setting that aside, On the last active day, these are just some pictures of things we did and some of the memorials we visited. On the last active day of our trip, we experienced something that blew all of our minds, and that really there was no way to prepare for. We met with an official from the National Unity and Reconciliation Commission, NERC, who recapped the history and reviewed the country's efforts to repair. And we were kind of familiar with this narrative. And then we met with the mayor of a southern district called Bugesera, who told us a little bit about some of the specificities of that district and the context that led up to the creation of these things called reconciliation villages. I'm going to loop back to the context to make sure I can get the story out, but I can provide some more detail about that. These are just pictures of, this is a sacred cattle in Rwanda. And we met with students from the University of Rwanda who have a memorial and on the campus to the genocide, because the genocide went straight into the college campus and slaughtered faculty and students, but faculty were also involved in the genocide. Rwanda is, incredibly complex. So this is the mayor of the district. They took us out to a village in this area that we knew had been set up for purposes of reconciliation in the late 1990s. It was opened in early 2001. And this was a village where people were incentivized to move to this area. They were given housing by the government, a small plot of land, a cow, so enough to support themselves. But the premise was that survivors would be living alongside perpetrators of the genocide. And the perpetrators were people who had confessed to their crimes. They were smaller scale perpetrators. They had been connected with the families of people they slaughtered or injured, usually slaughtered, and they had admitted to their crimes and in some cases sought forgiveness. We didn't really know what was going to happen at this village. I think we thought we were going to just get a tour of the premises and see people working and living. As it turned out, we walked into a community center that had about 40 people along one wall, and they were all assembled very properly, from the oldest elders to small babies, although in this picture this was a little bit later on and people were moving in and out of the room. We heard the stories of, so this is us on one side. This was how the room was set up. We were on one side and the villagers were on the other side. And then we heard the stories from people who stood up and told us how these villages got started and so forth. One villager stood up and told the story of how during the genocide, her husband and two young sons her husband had been killed, thrown into a pit, two sons thrown in alive and buried and killed that way during the genocide. She escaped with only her daughter on her back. She then points to a man across the room and says, "Please come over here." He stands up, walks across the room, and she says, "This is the man who killed my husband and sons. And I have forgiven him, and he is today my friend." And then he proceeds to tell his story of how he got caught up. This isn't his name is Filbert. He's actually the man on the very left side of the screen here. And I don't have a picture of Maria who told her story. And so he told his story about how he got caught up in genocide ideology, how he was called up to kill. They were living in an area where Tutsi were concentrated, and this was part of a process before the genocide, sort of testing out killing strategies in that area. And he talks about how gradually over time, with them living side by side, he initially had no intention of even talking to Maria, but he knew who she was. He knew how he had affected their lives. Over time, the two became acquainted, began to communicate, began to talk about their stories, began a friendship, and she said, among other things in that encounter, that he was the only person who truly knew what happened, the only other person who knew her trauma. And they built over years a friendship that has led to a great deal of reconciliation. This was described as the centerpiece of, or one common story in this village. The young woman here in the back is the daughter that she carried to Burundi on her back. And so we learned these stories. Just a couple of quick takeaways for us to think about. So I'm really sort of provoking some questions here. Miracles can happen under conditions that people would never choose under normal circumstances. Miracles of radical forgiveness. An undemocratic regime, which Rwanda is, which passes for a parliamentary republic, with noble intentions, like to unify a country in the wake of massive trauma, can facilitate processes that would be unlikely in any democracy because no one would agree to enter into those conditions. And yet, this kind of repair work would arguably never have happened for these individuals, for these families, without those conditions. So we would not, under normal circumstances regarding our own historical traumas and fractures, call it ethical to incentivize reconciliation through material provisions, as was the case here. Imagine this in the wake of lynching. Imagine this in the wake of the Holocaust. And yet, Rwanda was a country that had to find a way to come together, one of the most dense countries in Africa, where almost everyone was impacted by the genocide. And so our class was left with more questions than answers through the course of this engagement with these villagers. And I just wanted to sort of throw those questions out. I could provide more context for those villages and why they were set up later. Thank you.
Thank you. Shifting over to Professor McMickens, you have been part of the Intergroup Dialogue Initiative within Communication Studies for several years now. Do you believe dialogue can help heal the tears, rips, and gaping wounds that students experience in a socially unjust world? If so, how must dialogue be shaped, enhanced, and/or facilitated in order to promote its capacities for radical forgiveness?
So I think that dialogue can do this. I think that it can promote healing, it can lead to radical forgiveness, but those are during the times that it doesn't break down, that it does work, right? There are times that dialogue does not work, and we can circle back to that during the question and answer period as well. But thinking through when it does work, I think the approach that we take in our courses, at least the courses that I co-facilitate, is to dialogue across difference. So when dialogue works, we can see changes in people's perceptions across difference, in the way that they understand people who are different from them, in the way that they understand other people's backgrounds, and just in the way that they perspective take. So we do see those kinds of shifts. We also see the students start to name conditions, material realities for folks. We start to see them name race. A lot of our students are still afraid to say the word black, still afraid to say brown or white. And so just even getting students to that point, we do start to see those naming things start to shift. But importantly, we start to see shifts in how they view the social and political world around them. And I think that particularly because we talk about contentious issues around privilege and oppression, we center marginalized voices in those spaces, that we start to see people who have, for example, my students have expressed that some of their earliest interactions with people who were racially different occurred in high school, and then they came to college a few years later. And so we start to see them thinking about or being exposed to experiences in which they have very limited knowledge, and it really, you can see the light bulbs going off. And this is when, in an ideal situation, when dialogue is working. So when students actively engage and when they listen to others' experiences, it also challenges their previously held beliefs. It challenges knowledge about other stereotypes and implicit bias that they hold. And when that happens, we make room for understanding, which is one of the big goals of dialogue, to create a sense of shared understanding, to create perspective taking, to enhance empathy in other folks. And so in that idealized sort of version of dialogue, I say that because we, in this space, have to do many things at once. So we're educating students about the issues as we expect them to practice their dialogue skills and learn about dialogue skills and then use them. And so there's a lot of things that are going on in 10 weeks. And so, so no pressure. But when that happens, we see that there's room for understanding others' experiences, identifying sources of conflict, and more. And I think that's really powerful. I think that lends itself toward healing and toward radical forgiveness. So I do want to say that one thing that really stands out to me is that students have expressed that they don't have places in other classrooms where they can even talk about issues about race, sexuality, gender, in ways, not just talking about it in general for class discussion or unpacking lectures or readings, but in ways that can help transform relationships, in ways that can build trust and lead to a commitment to engaging. And so because of that, or through that, I should say, we'll see that alliance building that is our ultimate dream of dialogue, coalition building, right? Putting your body on the line and activating you, I suppose I should say. So in order to facilitate the dialogue and promote these things, I'll explain a few pertinent things that we can do, beginning with foregrounding dialogue is not debate. It's not a discussion of facts, right? So we're trying to dig deeper into people's feelings, and we're trying to dig deeper into people's experiences. We're reflecting, we're analyzing and exploring institutional power while continuing to develop our dialogue skills, of course, right? So I mapped out, I think I'm going to call them my top 5 or top 4 things, top 5 things that I think we should bring into the space if we're going to facilitate with the goal of healing and radical forgiveness. One is that we enter dialogue with the goal of promoting increased understanding through empathy and perspective taking. So if we enter we enter dialogue with the goal of promoting increased understanding through empathy and perspective taking. So that's our goal as facilitators and as getting students to that place as well, right? What does it mean that I haven't had contact with a black or brown person, right? What does it mean that I haven't met a trans person, right? And so trying to get people to that point of understanding and really heightening that level of empathy and perspective taking is an important goal for facilitators entering into that space. The second thing is that as a facilitator, we need to model vulnerability with our students. I think that's really important. That's actually, if I'm modeling vulnerability, it's one of my, the points that I will always need to work on, because I don't want people to see me cry. I want to be tough, don't want to be seen as weak, because for my identities as a black lesbian woman, that means that I'm less intelligent, potentially, right? And so there's more on the line for me, I feel, when I am that vulnerable. But I do believe in pushing through that in my when I facilitate, because I think it's important for students to see that vulnerability. And one of the reasons is that we are all going to make mistakes in talking about race, and talking about sexuality and gender, ability, etc. And so for me, sharing some of my vulnerability also helps with the reflection and unpacking the issues and learning from them. So when I enter into a classroom space on day one, I start talking to the students about who I am and my identities, because I'm not leaving those identities at the door. And I don't expect that from my students. That helps us see the world around us. It helps us make sense of things, and then also see where we need to improve in our thinking, right? The third thing that I'll talk about is that facilitators have to understand how historical traumas are connected to the present. When you're talking about racism, sexism, when you're talking about all of these other isms, there is a historical link that comes into that present space. And that's something that we as facilitators have to have a keen awareness of. And so we have to have what I'm going to call an intersectional consciousness a good level of that. And that basically means know what you're talking about in terms of race. What are the histories? What are the triggers? What are people's traumas and experiences? What are they bringing to the table, right? Because we need to sometimes understand that we might be reharming students violently in those spaces. And so if we don't have a good level of consciousness about the issues that we're trying to talk about, the contentious issues, then that can really do irreparable harm in a dialogue session. Moving on to number 4, which is similarly related, I think that dialogue we should all bring into the space an intersectional reflexivity. And what I mean by that is that we're moving from mere self-reflection into self-implication, right, and accountability. And so checking in on, for example, if I co-facilitate, checking in on my power and how I impact that space. Not only am I impacting the space by walking in as a black woman, as a black queer woman who's a mother, but what power do I hold? So in many ways I'm marginalized, but I can't ignore the places in which I'm privileged, right? And what that does to the space. And so that intersectional reflexivity can be really transformative in terms of holding ourselves accountable, right? And then through that, we open up the possibilities of what we're talking about with coalition building. Because one thing that will really help us in terms of healing, which I think it takes more than dialogue to heal, and we can come back to that. But one thing in terms of dialogue and healing is that it's not going to end there. We shouldn't expect that it ends in the classroom. We should expect that what we're doing in that space carries over into our family spaces, friendship circles, into where we're working and other areas of our lives, right? Institutions. So the last thing is that we need to think about centering the voices of the marginalized and focus on issues of oppression and privilege. So if we're doing all the other 4 things that we're talking about, we need to have an understanding of oppression and privilege, and we need to center marginalized voices. Far too many times, we have to have separate spaces for black and brown folks, for queer folks to tell their stories and have their stories heard. And so I'm very intentional with that in this space, that we are going to center the experiences of marginalized voices in this space, and we're going to talk through our own issues of oppression and privilege. I'm going to be vulnerable and work on myself. But I do think that all of these things are ongoing. You don't master these things. You continually try to engage. You continually try to grow, I'll say. And so I think that through that, taken together, facilitators really have the opportunity to help build those bridges toward healing and get to a place of radical forgiveness.
Thank you. So shifting gears a bit into radical imagination, Professor Beltran, I'm wondering how methods of inquiry, of hearing and representing, and created knowledge, of teaching might disrupt or sustain systems of power, privilege, and oppression. And particularly, how might decolonizing methodologies, embodied knowledge, digital narrative build a transformative space in the classroom? And what are some limits, if you have time?
Just a few simple questions.
Yes, just a few.
Well, first I want to say thank you for the invitation to be a part of this panel, and thank you to the fellow panelists. One of the best parts, I think, of being a professor is being a perpetual student and learning from incredible people. So since there are so many things to respond to, I thought maybe I would use a poetic exemplar to move us into feeling about the ideas that I'll share. So I will stand up for this. And this is how I start most of my classes. So this is called Teaching Philosophy, or First Day of Class. Dios enchim aniavu, gualit lanetzi, buenos dias, good morning class. Please do not take out your books, put down your pen and paper, come out from behind your rows and desks. We will need access to your ombligo, your belly, the place where your umbilical cord once connected you to your mother, to the stars, to all of creation. Did you know it still does? We will begin with a dedication in haikus. What do you think about love? As an ethic, as a philosophical principle from which our praxis might emanate? Are you able to transcend candy hearts and roller coasters to consider love as a process that lights the fire for equality, transformation, and honoring as others lift themselves to freedom? We will not need the manual. Nope, this class is a dance. We learn by joining the circle even when we don't know the steps. You should expect to slip, to fall, to bump into each other. That's how you learn, after all. Close your eyes, please, class. We will be taking a guided meditation, a journey, where time and space is measured by footsteps, heartbeats, breaths, and memory, not calculated by credit hours, dollar signs, price per unit, or final grades. We are all connected by process, not product. Your final project is to walk in beauty. So, thank you. So in thinking about how methods disrupt and poetry as a method, and particularly about decolonizing methodologies in teaching and research, the more that I contemplate what it means to do decolonizing work, the more I realize it is not entirely and maybe not at all possible. And part of that is because it centers or positions all of our work in relationship to colonization. And so I will continue to use that language because there is a limited set of radical language of inquiry, while I will simultaneously trouble it. And that means I live the trouble inside my body. So rather than really actually disrupting or creating fully decolonized spaces, what I think we can do is to create moments of transcendence. And we can do that through embracing other ways of knowing. And even just using other ways of knowing as it like centering the colonial, right? But think about indigenizing or queering our spaces, browning our spaces, in that we use the voices of our lived experiences to explore ideas. And that might look like, and we can do that in our research, we can do that in our teaching, we can do that in all kinds of spaces, in our dialogues, in our relationships. But what it looks like in the concrete is to use things like poetry, music, movement, mindfulness. And I consider all of these narrative-based techniques. I teach a class on historical trauma and healing, and the whole historical trauma class is here, and so they are really well familiar with what narrative is. It's all encompassing, and it's really about taking charge of narrative, taking charge of the stories that are told about the communities that we come from, that we care about. So what that looks like too in the classroom, other than using these creative expressive forms, is also getting out of the classroom, getting engaged with place. So when we talk about the definition of genocide, which we can separate ourselves from the actual lived experience because we're looking at the definition and we're analyzing it, and what does it include and what does it not include. We'd have this conversation, and then we walk across campus from the School of Social Work to the Holocaust Memorial classroom, and we sit there. And maybe we read some poetry while we're there, and maybe we don't talk. We are just there. Another thing we have done is, in exploring the relationship that DU has to colonial occupation, is to rewalk the last leg of the Sand Creek Massacre spiritual run and healing walk, to honor the work that the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes have done to heal from this legacy, and how transcendent that experience is to follow the footsteps and stop in each place that the tribes have designated as important places for healing. And we don't talk a lot. We talk a little bit. We just kind of, what's coming up for you? What are the sensory experiences? But I've found that it tends to be a space where people make the most connections between the academic and the lived. And then therefore, from there, you find a way to respond. to actually disrupt. And sometimes you don't. And sometimes it is an unanswerable thing, and that actually is a constant thread in our classes, that there's a lot that we actually can't fix, we can't wrap up, and we can't make it feel better. So ultimately, what I think we can do in facilitating these spaces and using some of the techniques that you talked about with dialogue is to extend grace and understand the complexity and irreconcilable nature of colonization within a colonial space. So, I mean, it's just, the tension is just there. And we will inevitably, within that space, with our limited language, inevitably reproduce colonial processes. I mean, just last week I did this. And my students were like, you just said the thing you told us not to say. You just did the thing. And I was like, I sure did. Damn it. Sneaky colonization, even with somebody who studies decolonizing and tries to live it. So, and having some grace, you know, and being able, I think, in terms of considering radical forgiveness, forgive ourselves for where we are within that process of healing. And have some peace with being undone. And to understand that we both disrupt and sustain colonization at the same time. And hopefully, with some of our creative, expressive possibilities, we can do so with grace and hopefully a little bit of laughter.
Professor Trigoso, one of the most vexing challenges of our time, and one that further instantiates injustice through disproportionate effects, is climate change. What lessons have you learned in your teaching, broadly defined on and off campus, and your work in terms of how radical imagination might allow people to work together to overcome biases and deeply entrenched beliefs? How might we move from thinking of radical imagination as a prefigurative politics into a different way of doing things now, especially in the context of this pressing issue that faces us?
Thank you. Thanks to everybody for the invitation and for the awesome panel that is sharing this experience with me. So, yes, so climate change, okay. We are at the crossroads today, and I'm just going to start with some of the main ideas that I discussed during my classes. Climate change is real, it is us, experts agree, it is bad, but there is hope. Okay, so that summarizes what I teach. So, radical imagination. No. There was a time and a place in the 1980s where we discovered that CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, were really bad for our ozone layer. It took 4 to 5 years from when the settled science was put out to the public, the broader scientific community, for that to get to an international agreement that radically reduced and banned CFCs. Has been the most successful international agreement today, no? The Montreal Protocol. So it is extremely discouraging for somebody like me. I thought, when I was studying climate change, when I was a master, a doctoral student, that we will be beyond discussing the basis for the science. We will be discussing solutions, what to do. This is not the case today, and I see myself repeating a lot of what I teach year after year because there's so much misinformation. Okay, so we have to refer back to basics of chemistry and physics. Okay, so where does the idea of radical imagination falls here? Again, imagining a community of scientists, lay people, everybody, who has a stake here. So all of us, truly, who actually we give the proper place of science in our community. That we listen to the people who actually conduct research on that. And once that we get the data, we corroborate that, we can move on to find solutions. Okay. For me, it's been extremely difficult to teach climate change this term because of the unfolding events with the IPCC 1.5 degree special report with a national climate assessment that was very recently released. We only have 12 years to do something. Okay. And I have to tell my students, and I have to recognize our generation, my generation has failed. Okay. As a student, as a doctoral student, I attended the Copenhagen Conference of the Parties in 2009, where we thought we will finally reach an agreement. There were these smears attack to the scientific community with Climate Gate, and we haven't done anything. 10 years later, we're still discussing the basics. Radical imagination in the United States are one of the few places where we don't fully accept climate change science. I want to imagine a place where we don't have Citizens United, where we don't have corporations that I've seen as very important people, not just people, corporations that finance lots of political campaigns, and this is why we have seen a lot of retractions from both sides of the aisle. What we see in their pursuit of what to do and what to accept about climate science. We have a very strong consensus. Over 97% of climate scientists agree on this, but yet we have leaders who cherry-picked information for the few dozens who could be easily linked, many of them could be easily linked to big oil interests. How do we move away from that? What keeps me going, given that I absorb all this, of course, affects me as a person. What I know, what is at stake. What keeps me going is the faces of my students. All the incredible initiatives and what they get accomplished at the Center for Sustainability, for example, or how eager they are to go out and fight. No? What we get from children like this Swedish 15-year-old girl, Greta Thunberg, who actually is doing something, accomplished way more than somebody like me that has been educated for a long period of time about climate change. So I see a lot of hope with present and newer generations. My radical imagination that my students, young people, participate more in politics. You'll be able to elect better leaders from all political parties. That we actually, again, listen to science, to information that is available. That we don't get to contaminate the web, for example, with misleading information. In my climate change and society class, I use and I try to bring a lot of climate literacy, information literacy to my students. I send them to the dark sides of the web to find, websites that are financed by special interests that have all these dissemination apparatus for misleading data about climate change. They go there and they are really amazed of the scale of this effort. And again, we are caught in a time and a place where our scientists are telling us there's 12 years to do something. What is there to do? There's some distractions, important distractions. We were recently discussing geoengineering. We came up with the conclusion that geoengineering is more about saving our status quo, about consumption of fossil fuels, rather than to doing something about climate change. That came from my students. There's a lot of information that I wish we could get away from. It's really scary to see what will happen, but again, there is hope. The hope that I see from people who are eager to do something, the hope that I see from a generation that I think there will be the successful ones, not us, but I that's where imagination is taking radical imagination. In the terms of radical forgiveness, how do I reconcile all of that with politicians that purposely choose this misleading information while you have access to, the state-of-the-art data, information from any different incredible scientific organizations that we have in the U.S. So purposely taking that information and transforming it into misleading information, we should do something, be cognizant of that, and do something against this negative apparatus.
Professor Luteniger, I think we're often too apt to think of issues of inclusivity and social justice as solely belonging within the domain of humanities and social sciences. Yet engineering and computer science have been working diligently to create a more equitable, inclusive space on campus. What have you learned positively and as an area needing growth about scaling up or scaling out diverse, equitable, and inclusive learning environments? And do you believe the university might be a space of radical imagination with traction in professional fields like computer programming, which have not been the most welcoming, let alone just spaces?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. And I'd like to start with the word just. I want to speak back to what happened last year when the ACLU did a little experiment where they took some software called Rekognition, spelled with a K, that does face recognition and matches it to databases to determine whether a person is potentially a criminal. They ran this software on the United States Congress, so 440 representatives, 100 senators. And they actually came up with 4% of those folk were potentially criminals. Now, as somebody that enjoys political humor, that's sort of funny, okay? But then, out of those 540 congressional members, 48 of them are Black or African American. 6 of those 28 people that were incorrectly labeled as possibly criminals were Black. And so disproportionately, that is saying that 21% of our Black congresspeople were flagged by this software as being potentially criminals. This software is used by law enforcement. The software is running on cameras in many locations throughout our country. We're not to the level of England and China yet, but we will be in terms of surveillance of everybody. And the software is flawed. It is biased. A lot of people seem to think that technology is going to solve bias because we can have objective computers that are not going to be beholden to the same biases and mistakes that we as flawed humans have. Well, I just want to point out a couple of other things. Some of you may have been aware of this one. There was a PhD student at MIT. She was using face recognition software as part of her research, but she is a dark-skinned African American, and it wouldn't even recognize her as a person, let alone who she was. And she had to go to using some of her white colleagues to be able to do her research study. The cool thing about that is she created something called the Algorithmic Justice League, which is really quite beautiful. Software has been created for predicting recidivism and used for determining whether somebody should get parole. Again, if you look at the outcomes, it's disproportionately biased against African Americans. And same software has been used for setting bail. We're now creating software to determine who gets mortgages. We're using software to determine who gets in a job for initial screenings. We're using software to determine who gets into school. Those flaws in these most egregious cases that I pointed out are being perpetuated in all software going forward. And so the question is why? And now this is going to speak to your question on welcoming environment. Let's talk about who is a computer scientist. This is a computer scientist. White, or Asian and male. So right now, I'm going to just start at the end of the pipeline and talk about PhDs. Last year, 700 PhDs produced in this country in computer science. Of those, any guesses on how many were female and African American?
5.
Actually, you guys are good, 4. And how many were Latinas? 2. And if you look over the past 5 years, you will find years where those numbers were 0 in many cases. In general, women make up about 18% of computer science at all levels. It actually drops down at the master's level. And people of color, it's in general around 1 to 6% depending upon bachelor's, master's, or PhD. There's a bump for Latinos at about 6% at the bachelor's, but everything else is, not that that's good, but everything else is atrocious. So the people making this software are predominantly white and Asian dudes, okay? So that has implications on all of the implicit biases that they had. And they're not only that, they're young dudes. There was an article that just came out today, which I at first chortled over when I read, and then I got really depressed. It was about how they have created a workshop for dealing with aging and being older in the tech field, and it's 30 and 40-year-olds that are attending. But what that says, speaking from my own personal experience, the fog of testosterone tends to diminish somewhere in the 30s or maybe 40, which means that the wise people in Silicon Valley, the wise males, are already old and not even being listened to. So you also asked about efforts on campus and what is problematic, what is working well. I want to just actually talk about a few things that we're doing that I think are working well. First of all, we have a program called eSTEM for Equity in STEM, which is a cohort model for working with underrepresented students to retain and help them. And this is, the director of this is Anthea Johnson. I don't think she's here. Strongly supported by Nancy Sasaki from NISM, who just left. And 24 out of 25 of our first cohort students have gone on. That's better than the DU retention model for all students. And so what that speaks to is if interventions are done that include cohort models, brave spaces, and talking about power and privilege in the sciences, engineering, and computer science, we can make a difference. Also, just in terms of what's working well or bright spots, the faculty recognize that this is an issue. And that, I mean, that should not sound like a big, huge revolutionary step, but I'm sorry, in engineering and computer science, the fact that faculty are aware is the first step, and I'm glad to report that many of them are aware. We did a microaggression workshop with the faculty last year, and we had nearly 100% attention. We're going to be doing interactive role-playing with Affinity Arts later this year around these issues, so I expect something similar. Other good things, our administration actually cares. So as somebody that's been at a university for a long time, and we like to make fun of administration, I actually believe they care and they're putting their money where their mouth is, and that is huge. Challenges. So challenges that most of us say, well, it's not our problem, it's society's problem, and it's the crappy K-12 school system, because the students all showing up that want to do this are white and Asian males. So that's completely disowning what ability that we have to change the problem. One thing is outreach, another thing is looking at the climate within our own classrooms and what you can do in terms of an inclusive environment to actually be able to make the field a place where women and people of color actually want to study. Part of that, we have an NSF grant led by Christina Paguyo and Valentina Iturbi as part of that, Ron DeLizer and Chris Gauthier-Dickey and Bridget Aron, looking at interventions that we can try and change the climate on campus. So while it's a problem, things can be done. And the last things I'll say is we as engineers, computer scientists, we're about facts. We're about right or wrong. And when you said that dialogue is not debate, well, in my building, everything is frickin' debate. And dialogue is one step further away than where we're at. So we are at the infancy of dealing with this. Our backgrounds as educators has all been, for most parts, not every single one of us, but most of us, has all been science and tech and math and engineering, and not humanities and not social sciences and not issues that matter. And that's why, one of the many reasons why it's so important that the humanities be brought in to sciences and technology.
Okay. So, Dr. Iturbe Legrave, from your vantage in the OTL, what does transformation in the classroom mean? What does it look like? And how might you or any of us create or start to create a space for transformation?
Well, first I wanted to thank, can you all hear me? My voice is kind of going, but I wanted to thank everybody on this panel. It's just, I think that, you know, transformation is right here, right? I think we've heard what transformation is, what it takes to transform, and, you know, the commitment that we require to be agents of change, whether in the classroom or in the broader panorama of higher education in this country in this time. You know, for me, transformation in the classroom has a lot of buzzwords, right? But I take those abstract words and make them very concrete with the faculty that I work with. I would say, you know, the classroom can be and tends to be this place still, I mean, in the 21st century, still this place of diametrical opposition between teacher and student, where knowledge is used as this power differential that often silences a lot of the intersecting social identities that we bring into the classroom, all of us, right? Our students, whomever is teaching, all the voices. And I think it, you know, this is nothing new. These ideas have permeated the field, you know, really since the 70s, you know, in critical pedagogy. So for me, it's about dismantling this banking concept of education that is very much alive, and I see it. That is not to be pessimistic and say that's all I see. It certainly is not all I see. But transformation is just the beginning of that recognition that power, privilege, and oppression, and those very rigid vertical structures are operating in our classrooms, and they're operating in all aspects of our students' lives and our lives, right? I mean, I experienced this as a Latina, as a mother of 4 brown children. You know, I see it. It comes into my home. It is something that I constantly have to deal with. And so I would say, from my vantage point in the OTL, all I see is transformation. I guess that could be my job description, you know, is witness to transformation. I have countless faculty, many of whom are in this room today, who have recognized that something has happened, that they don't feel comfortable in this space, that a student might be silenced and not feel comfortable, that something has been triggered that changes their very conception of how they teach and how their students are learning. You know, I think what it looks like, lots of things, right? It could be my working with faculty for 2 quarters in a row and truly redesigning every single aspect of a course, right? Everything. From how a student will encounter a reading and how we will invite them to be triggered, to open themselves to that discomfort and really walk through it formatively, not in fear, right? Because that's all our students are hearing. I mean, it's prevalent, and that's something that is very clear in Dr. Johnson's work and in the work of many of our colleagues up here is, you know, fear. Whenever I say the word trigger, immediately I have people go, oh my God, another trigger warning. Should I use a trigger warning? I don't want to use a trigger warning. No, embrace the trigger. Embrace that trigger, right? It's a potentially transformative moment, but we don't necessarily have the tools and the language and the space and time within certain classrooms that are still built upon these very archaic structures, right? To embrace those triggers. So it looks like, what does it look like? It could be me coming into a classroom with some of my colleagues in the room and videotaping an entire class, and then engaging with that faculty member and having the faculty member watch themselves teach for the first time in 15 years and realize many things. I just can be a mirror for that, right? So how do we change in a way that's not punitive, that doesn't feel punitive, that really embraces the whole self of the faculty member who's in front of that room and carries a heavy burden, right? Because our students expect us to be superheroes and to have the right answer and the right facilitation skill and the right intervention in the appropriate time and not miss anything. It's impossible. It's impossible to do that. So, I see it all the time. I think certainly here at DU, something that Scott just alluded to, the fact that we have commitment, right, from the administration, from higher above. This is permeating the strategic plan, and I hear lots of things. I work with faculty primarily, that's my role, but I'm surprised every quarter by the amount of grad students or undergrad students that show up in my office, and they're saying, you're not doing anything. Nothing's changing. This just happened to me, or, my professor just said this, or my classmate said that, or did this. And I have to just almost, unravel this accordion of things that we're doing, of transformation that is in fact occurring, that is taking place, right? I can speak to one example off of what Scott was saying. We had a very popular software that is used to create teams. Scott, what is the name of this again? CATME. Thank you, Christina. So we had, for example, what transformation looks like. CATME, we're using this awesome software to create teams, and it's working great. And then I show up in the learning environment with my camera, right? And oh my God, we have a room that has all of our students of color on one side, all of our white students on the other. CATME did it. CATME did it. CATME failed, right? And so going in, that's what transformation looks like. For a faculty member to say, oh, did you just see that? I saw that. We have to change it. We have to do something right away, and we're not going to wait till the end of the quarter. We're going to have an intervention right away, and we're going to turn this around. And, the growth that comes from that, the healing that comes from that, and the awareness, because I think we heard in the panel already that not all of our students have the language. I dare to say that many of our undergraduate students lack the language. Even some of my own children who are in high school lack the language, and they're my children. So, coming from a place of love, I don't think we have enough love and enough space for love in the classroom, but that to me is transformation. We need to come in with some more love and to really be aware, and before we walk into that space, acknowledge the power, privilege, and oppression are certainly at play. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We have time for some reflections from Dr. Amber Johnson.
All right, can everybody just stand up for a sec if you are able? And just take a deep breath. That was a lot of information packed into a tiny little cell of time. So I don't know, maybe sing head, shoulders, knees, and toes, whatever you gotta do. Shake those limbs out and just try to feel all that stuff in your body, because we heard some really awesome stuff that feels hopeful and some really scary stuff that doesn't feel so hopeful. You can sit if you need to, you can stay standing if you need to, you can walk around, whatever you need, just be in your body. So I heard some really important themes that I think I want to touch on, and that's institutionalized healing versus institutionalized oppression. And funny enough, I feel like there's a pretty clear split between how the panelists spoke about these things and what's happening that's actually transformative. So thank you for all of the work that y'all are doing. It's magnificent, and it's extremely important, also extremely difficult. So starting with institutionalized oppression. So I picked up on this with Scott. Robin, Erica, and some of what Valentina spoke about. So with Scott, so there's this whole movement called abolishing big data. And it's not about getting rid of big data, but it's about abolishing the bias practices that are infused into the data, right? So in that respect, we look at institutionalized oppression as in the biases of the white men creating these algorithms and processes. Their biases are now institutionalized and affect all of us in ways that most of us don't even know. We didn't even think about it. So that's, and yes, there is, when the internet was created, I was alive. Well, maybe not when it was like created for the military, but when it became a thing for lay folk. There was this idea that it was going to emancipate us from like the gender binary because there was no gender in computers. So then thinking about, and the person that Scott was talking about is Joy Buolamwini, who created the algorithms for Algorithmic Justice League. Amazing, amazing human with beautiful ideas. She writes poetry to sort of help heal through understanding how these algorithms have affected her and other Black women of color specifically. And then thinking about what Robin said. Robin said something that just like made my heart sink. We were so busy criminalizing these things that there isn't even room for forgiveness. So that was an institutional decision too. It was an institutional decision to say, let's focus on process and revenue streams and not real humans and their lives and how these things impact their actual lived experience, right? Then you've got Erica talking about climate change. So that was also an institutional decision to focus on anti-intellectualism, right? And not looking at science as evidence, but instead, let's take away the credibility, then we can push our agendas, right? That's also an institutional decision to keep folks oppressed, especially our environment. And if folks don't care about our environment, well, they definitely don't care about you, because we can't exist without it. And then with Valentina talking about institutionalized power in education, right? So even just the classroom as a democratic space. Well, no, like students don't help us write our syllabi. Y'all should, right? Students don't choose what you want to read, but y'all should, right? So what happens when we level the playing field in terms of power in the classroom and who decides what we're learning? Because then that opens up space for us to be learning all the time with each other, right? And not top-down teaching. So then I said, okay, well, let's think about the institutionalized healing practices. So something that Nancy said, right? The operative word here is healing. And so the things that I do are just tools in a huge bucket of healing tools. Dialogue is a tool. Radical forgiveness is a tool. These are just tools, but the operative word really is healing. So what happened in Rwanda, if I go back to my notes, I think, Nancy, you said no one would sign up to do that. Where is it? Yes, no one in the world would agree to enter into those conditions, right? But in reality, most of us are already in those conditions, right? So my question is, what happens when our government institutionalizes incentivizing healing as we are already standing next to our oppressors and those who have caused us harm? So I think it's a good idea. Pay me to be around my oppressors because I'm with them all the goddamn time. Right? And then thinking about Ramona's work with decolonizing research, right? And Taisha's work around dialogue. These are also institutional decisions that we can make to switch the fabric of stuff. So what's happening here, right, at DU or at campuses all over the US and really all around the earth, is that we're choosing to institutionalize the oppressive decisions versus the healing ones. So what does this have to do with my work? Well, I'm hoping that what I'm doing is creating space through my little exhibits to decolonize the research process, but also to empower people to take control of their healing. And so I do that in a number of ways. So with Radical Imagination, if you ask an activist to tell you what's wrong with the world, they could talk for 2 years straight. Right? You ask an activist what world they want to live in, we usually get crickets because it's another institutional decision to focus on deconstructing systems of power versus building entirely new systems. Why? Because those systems of power keep the institutional power in place. Right? So y'all can talk about it all you want. Keep talking. Keep doing your little science, right? That science that doesn't even matter, right? You just keep doing your little science, and you keep talking. And I'm going to keep you busy, because while you're talking, I'm going to just keep messing stuff up, okay? So if we stop talking and start building, things start to change. So in this box of toys and stuff that's just really required to play, we're asking people to start to imagine beyond the constraints. But what the real magic, we thought we were just going to go into this collecting ideas, like literally a database of ideas to improve just spaces and create just spaces, whatever. But really, we decolonized the research process because what happens is community members come, they identify their own problems, they identify their own solutions, they assess those solutions, and then they talk about implementing them, all while I'm just watching and observing. So I have nothing to do with this process. So instead of me coming as a researcher saying this is what's wrong, let me fix it for you, right? Savior complex. I'm saying, y'all fix your own problems and let me just have some resources here for you to use however you see fit. And then with radical imagination, again, just empowering people to take these tools and use them at their leisure instead of forcing people to do certain things. Because when we force people to do certain things, that is also an operative of colonization, right? Mm-hmm. So what does it look like to curate all the ways in which community members are healing and disseminate that at large instead of keeping these things hidden or assuming that academics have all the answers, because we don't. We just don't. So one of the things that I'm doing is I'm starting, speaking of institutionalizing, an Institute for Healing, Justice, and Equity at the school I work at. And our whole motto is you have to curate and value what community members bring to the table. You have to compensate those community members for their intellectual property, right? And then you have to disseminate them for free in ways that are completely accessible and equitable so that people can actually use them instead of hoarding knowledge as if it's something that we can contain and consume for ourselves. So I will add, though, that if we're going to do this work and if we're going to talk about institutionalizing healing, we have to really put our focus on mental health because this work is really hard. Yes. And so I'm guessing that most of the people in here are in here because you're already doing this work in some way, shape, or form, right? So that's another institutional decision, not making it mandatory for the people at the top who actually make decisions to be in these spaces and listen to what you have to say and value what you have to say and value the work that you do. But if you're going to do this work, you got to take care of yourself. Right? So what does it look like to make institutional decisions where mental health is put up at the forefront, right? I think that's all I have to say.
So I think that we have time for maybe a couple of questions from the audience.
So this can be not Ramona because we've already talked about this, but maybe anyone else could answer. So I heard, especially with the climate change discussion or comments, this is something I've been wrestling with, is this sort of either or. I don't like either ors. Either you're pro-science or you're not. Either you're pro-decolonizing science or you're not. Right? I'm not saying that that's true for everyone, but this dichotomy supposedly of like, we believe the scientists or we don't believe the scientists because we believe in community and we believe in lived experiences. So I just would like, if y'all have any enlightening words about how to wrestle through that really difficult thing for me of like, how do I support science and knowledge and say believe the people who study climate change and not support people who say the only way to know something is to do a randomized controlled trial. Just an easy.
I think, yeah. Rather than believe, I would say trust, because that's belief could be something abstract, could be something subjective, but when you have hard numbers that come from meteorological stations from all around the world, from climate proxies, from all our satellites, and all of that converging, amazing reports that bright people developed. It's more about trust, okay? And how do I wrestle with that? I guess we're, of course, we're all ignorant of something, okay? But when there is so many things that are at stake, our environment in particular, when we talk about climate change, then we need to know how to evaluate information. We need to know how to make decisions from all of that. It's not just hard data. That's the impacts of climate change is going to affect people in different ways. People in the United States are going to be affected in terms of, for example, a higher incidence of hurricanes, more wildfires in the Southwest. but we have a infrastructure, we have some protection layers. But if we think about people in Bangladesh, for example, we think about people in sub-Saharan Africa, how is that going to affect them? We need to interpret the data, within those frameworks, and we need to make sure that all of these people are included. Okay, so that's how I would approach that. It's not just look at these stats tables with all this information. It's just make sure that you include the people who are at stake.
So I will piggyback off of that. So I think a large part of this is recognizing that academics don't create knowledge alone, and that it's not our sole job as scientists to be the creators of this knowledge, but instead I approach everything from a place of curation. So there are people all over this earth who have understood what climate change is, what it looks like, how it feels, and how to fix it, who aren't scientists in the traditional sense, who might use different words, but they have wonderful ideas. We just ignore them because they don't fit in the purview of academic life. So what does it mean to curate those ideas and then disseminate them versus saying I'm the keeper of the ideas and the creator of them, right? And that's absolutely a conflict of interest too, right? So I focus on curating versus being the keeper of something. And like I'm the authoritative power.
I would add to that. This morning I walked into the office and Christina she walked in and I was rereading some of Freire's work, and I wrote down this quote that it just brings all of this so beautifully. But it again, like, this is replaying these really archaic structures, right, that are so embedded, like even in our feeling and our thinking. So we really need to break away. But one of the things that he says that I love is he says, ideology of oppression projects absolute ignorance unto others. Right? So again, like, these are people, these are stories, these are lives. The language will be different, the words will be different, the very discipline will look different, feel different. And if we can start being there, right, outside of these binaries and structures, I think that is a place of transformation.
Time for one more question?
Just to add one piece to your question or to this discussion, I think one way to break out of binary is to remember that science, which is a knowledge discourse that has been leveraged heavily against people of color and indigenous people around the world and queer people extremely, is just one discourse of empirical knowledge. It's just one discourse. Experiences are another set of discourses. People writing about their experiences with seas rising is another set of discourses. And so while I think I totally understand, and I also teach climate change in 2 of my classes, this crisis around the science being rendered incredible by denialists and people with vested interests in disputing it. There are so many other kinds of knowledges that are pointing to the same problem, and all of that is empirical knowledge. Experience is empirical knowledge. And so there are lots of ways. I don't think you have to be pro or anti-science, but you look at what is it, all these people in the South right now, in places where the flooding is getting excessive and regular. What are they saying? They are saying this is happening. They've been saying this. They were saying this before the science. They were ahead of the science. So remembering that there are often many different discourses through which we gain knowledge and can engage in debate and dialogue.
Wonderful. Well, once again, thank you so much to the panelists and also to Dr. Johnson for the great words around how we might make institutional decisions to heal and not to oppress. One of which I think our work could be to really feature mental health as part of our process right here at DU, and then also to consider how we as practitioners might not hoard knowledge but curate and disseminate. At the same time, I want to acknowledge once again all of the many myriad forms of labor and passion and love that Dr. Johnson has put into their work. Please go see